Hi, welcome to Mistake Man. This is going to be part 3 of my Destiny Engram box build. I'm building a gift box to look like a Destiny Engram. And as you can see here, I've got the two halves done. And I've got all of the internal structural supports in there, plus all of the rainbowy material that's been folded on the inside, plus the flashy hologram rainbow paper there. And something a little different from what you saw in the last video is I've added these white pentagons around each of those sections there. And I just did that because as I was looking at the engram from the game and comparing it to what I've built, I noticed that the edges of that internal dodecahedron glow in a white color. And I thought probably the easiest and best way to replicate that would just be to cut out some pentagons from just a regular white cardstock and glue those in. So I've got all those in there, and I like the effect. I think it looks pretty good. Ends up replicating the look of the engram a little bit better. So I think the last and final step is going to be to put the clear plastic pentagons that go on the outside faces of the dodecahedron. So I've got all those cut out, and this one here that doesn't have any flaps is going to go on that top one there because there are glue flaps already in each of those on each of those 5 edges. And then for the rest of the 5 pentagons going around, I've got these ones here that have 2 glue flaps, because on here there's just the 1, 2, 3 glue flaps already from the existing pieces. And then on these edges, the glue flaps are bent the other way into the adjacent pentagons. So I need to have a glue flap in those on those edges so I can attach to that edge. And I think I can just slide that glue flap down between the cellophane material and the thicker plastic sheet. I've kind of test fitted a little bit, and there's a little bit of interference here where I had attached the cellophane material where I'd use a little bit of that UV curing resin at the corners there. And yeah, so there's some spots there of glue, quote unquote glue. That resin is there. But I think what I can do is I can actually just cut these flaps, if you can see that there. I'll just cut the edge of that flap to a sharper angle on both sides, and then that seems to clear it well enough that I can get it in there. I was just kind of assuming all along, based off of my paper crafting experience, that doing the outside faces wouldn't be that difficult to do. It's not easy to do because you have to kind of line everything up, but it's also, I didn't think it was going to be that tricky either. Because with paper, you would just, pick an edge. I guess this piece goes there. So just pick an edge, put some glue on the flap, hold it down until the glue, 30, 40 seconds, whatever, till the glue has a strong enough bond it'll hold in place while I move on to the next ones. I do the next one and the third one, and then do the last 2 at once and put it down. I figured it would be that simple, but again, I run into the issue of what glue am I going to use to actually attach the clear plastic. So as I did I've already used a couple different approaches here. One was for the clear plastic to the black cardstock that's behind this rainbow paper here, was I just used the E6000. I held that down, and it worked well enough. It was super messy, too messy to actually use on any of the bonds that I can actually see. So that wasn't really going to be an option here because these are very visible. These are right front and center. So I have to do something else. On these internal support structures, ended up going with the double-sided tape because I could get in there and I could put pressure, put those together, and that's working well enough. There's a few spots where there's some crazing going on. You can kind of see it gets a little cloudy and some like fine lines. but that's really not too noticeable with all the other flashy stuff that's going on with the reflections from this rainbow cellophane. So, but I don't think I can use that approach on these, because with those, an important part of that was being able to get in there and apply pressure to both sides of that bond to make sure that the double-sided tape would actually adhere strongly. And I can't do that with this. I mean, I could maybe do it with one or two of them because I could kind of get my hand underneath there, but for the last two or three bonds, that's just not going to work. And I just don't think I can put enough solid pressure from the outside to actually get a double-sided tape to bond strongly enough. So I don't think that's going to work here. So what I'm leaning towards is using the UV curing resin on this as well. It's going to be tricky though because it can be messy to work with. I'll have to be really careful not to get drips and splatters. I have to make sure I put enough on there, because if I don't put enough, then I'm going to be able to see kind of the wavy glue, blob-shaped glue edges. I keep saying glue, it's resin, but you know what I mean. So if I don't put enough, there's going to be those blobby, wavy edges that'll be seen, and also it won't be as strong as it could be. If I put too much, then it's going to ooze out the sides, maybe drip and splatter and just look messy that way. So I'll have to be careful. I'll experiment with it to see what method works, but I honestly think that's going to be my only real option. The only other glues I have, I don't think are going to be that great. I could use the canopy glue. I think I showed this in one of the other videos, this canopy glue that I have. It's intended for gluing clear plastic canopies on aircraft models. And so it does dry clear, which is nice, and it does seem to bond strongly. And that's actually what I used to glue these white pentagons down. I did actually do a glue test on that, so I wasn't sure what was going to be the strongest. So I cut a few pieces of that rainbow paper and then just some pieces of the white cardstock. And this was the E6000. I glued that on there, and it was really strong. That was a great bond. But it was a little messy. And then I also tried some super glue. That wasn't quite as strong. It did bond, but it wasn't quite as strong, and you have to put a lot of pressure on that to get the bond to really develop. And I also tried the canopy glue, and it bonded strongly enough. You can see, hopefully you can see there's, instead of the paper tearing away from, there's kind of like a foiled plastic layer on top of that that gives that rainbow color. So it's kind of like a plastic to paper bond that's happening there. You can see the paper's bonded so strongly that it preferred to rip the paper apart rather than rip the paper from the plastic. So that's a sign of a good bond there. And it was easy to use. There's a small enough tip there that I could just dab out just what I needed without too much, which was kind of the issue with the E6000. That would have worked, the E6000, but it tends to come out in great gobs. And so that's why it ended up being a little bit messy. And I needed kind of a finer tip for just that narrow edge there. And I didn't glue all the way around. I just put a drop at each of the corners and in the middle of each edge, and that worked just fine. So anyway, so I think the canopy glue would probably work to hold the two pieces of plastic together, this clear plastic, but it would take so long to dry that I think it's just going to be impractical. So I'd have to put a bead on, hold it in place somehow for hours until it cured enough to be strong. And that's just, I don't want to do that if I don't have to. So I'm going to try the UV curing resin, because I can just put that on, zap it with the UV light for, I don't know, 20 seconds. And then that's enough to hold it in place so I can let it go, and then I can zap it for a little bit longer to make sure the full cure develops, and then move on to the next one. So I'll give that a try, and we'll see where it goes from there. Okay, so we're back, and I've been doing a lot with the clear plastic faces on here, these outer pentagons. And I've got this half complete, and I think it looks good. Man, it was challenging trying to get that UV curing resin to work. I think it was the right move. I think it worked out better than anything else I could have tried that I've thought of, at least. First one was a little rough. I did this one first, and especially the very, very first tab was really messy because I was just trying to hold everything by hand and zap it at the same time, and that was just messy. There were a couple of them where I zapped it and it was crooked or shifted to the side, and so I had to rip it off and do it again. I think I only had to do that twice across all those bonds, which is not too bad. So yeah, so that's. I mean, I think I think that's a pretty cool effect. Um, and this structure ended up being like I thought. Once I got those outside pentagons on there, it tightened the whole thing up, and it's not really flexible in any direction. This used to be really floppy, and it would kind of seesaw back and forth, but now it's not really doing that at all. So nice and solid. And then when I put the two halves together, this one I haven't done the outer pentagons on this one yet, but when I fit those two together, that edge it lines up great. So well, in fact, that I think I was contemplating different ways of building the hinge into this. And I mean, the idea was to just make one of these edges be a hinge. That was the original idea, and I kind of tossed around some ways of making the hinge. But the more I thought about it, and the more I thought about the way I'm actually attaching all this plastic together with this UV bonding resin, it's not the strongest bond in the world. Like I said, I had messed up a few of those edges and had to rip it off and start it over, and it's not that hard to rip off. If you just start peeling one edge off, it'll just come right off. I mean, altogether with, 5 edges bonded, it's strong enough that it's going to hold itself together. I'm not worried about it falling apart. But if I put any significant strain on this thing, the bonds do tend to split a little bit. So with that experience gained, with that knowledge in hand, I don't think anything I use as a hinge is going to have to be bonded in a similar way, and I don't think it's going to be strong enough to withstand multiple opens and closes. So I'm starting to just consider just not even doing a hinge and just have it be a box that you just lift the top off. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's going to be pretty stable, I guess it does kind of slide around a little bit, but that's not too bad. Okay, so next step really is just finish the bottom half. Just do these last few clear plastic pentagons on my bottom half. All right, so I've got most of the outside panels in place. All I have is just these last two right here. And I'm going to just go ahead and show you the process that I'm doing, just in case you're curious. So first thing I got to do is clean off the fingerprints. It's kind of messy, right? And this will be the last chance I get to do that on the inside. So I'll make sure I do that. Okay, so the next thing I got to do now is bend these tabs a little bit more. They're flared out a little bit too much. So when I try and put them in place, they want to push away from the edge. So I just have to overbend these so that they're about in the right spot. And I'm putting my cloth over that edge because I've been using these gloves with this UV curing resin. Sometimes it gets on my fingers and just kind of, I try to wipe most of it off, but there's still some residue there. And if I'm pushing on the clear plastic with these gloves, it tends to leave little marks there. So I've just learned it's better to protect this with the cloth so I don't have to keep wiping those smudges. They do come off, but I have to keep wiping them off. So I'd rather not do that. So there you can see, hopefully you can see the angle of that bend there. So now it's more this way. Or if you look at this one that I haven't done yet, it's still out that direction. So okay, so that'll make that a little bit easier to work with. I'll set that aside for a minute so I don't get any more smudges on it. Now I basically need to do the same thing to this, just clean up any remaining fingerprints on the flaps that I have. I've already cleaned up this stuff, these faces with the cellophane material when I put them in. I haven't really, and I've been careful not to touch them too much, so I'm not worried about cleaning those up. I'll just look and see if I see any large flecks of dust or debris, then I'll blow them out. Alright, looks okay to me. Now I do need to also overbend these tabs. So right now they're sticking up quite a ways. See that? So when I try and put the clear plastic sheet on top, it just wants to sit way above, as you can see there. So I want to make it just a little bit easier to work with, so I'm going to bend those tabs down a little further. But I do have to be careful because I've already got some resin and double-sided tape on some of these joints, existing joints, and if I flex that too much, put too much strain on it, then it's going to snap some of those joints. So do want to be careful. Some of this might be off shot for a second, or my arm might be in the way, but just doing it slowly and carefully. Okay, if you can see that, that's a lot better. You can see the difference between this one and that one. So okay, one more. Got to do this one on the inside edge here. It's easier to do that one now because before I put this face on, even though this is going to be for the next face, it's easier to do it now while I've still got access to the back of it. Seems I can get a little bit better pressure on it to actually bend it over. All right, so now I've got to get it prepped. So I'm just going to test fit it here. I have been cutting these corners back, so it's the angle is further that way, because there are dabs of the UV curing resin at the corners of each of this cellophane material that's holding it inside, and so they tend to interfere right there, where that glue flap, because the glue flap has to slide in back behind the cellophane material there. If you can see that, kind of hard to see, but there you go. So there's the cellophane material and then here's the plastic wall, and the glue flap has to slide in between there to bond to that plastic wall. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut those because I know that's going to make that fit easier. So all I'm doing is just getting some scissors and just cutting a sharper angle on that. Shallower angle, depending on how you look at it. Okay, hopefully you can see that a little bit better there. Okay, so that feels like it's going to fit just fine. Without interfering with those little blobs of glue right there, so I'm good with that. So now is the trickiest part of this whole thing, is just getting this to hold in place for gluing the first bond, the first joint. So what I've been doing is just using masking tape, strips of masking tape around each of the 5 edges to get it kind of more or less held in place, and then I'll remove one piece on the, maybe 2 pieces on the edge that I want to glue down one at a time. So, and I always start with the edges that have the glue flaps on, these 2 edges on the outside pentagon. So always start with those because those are the most finicky. Okay, that went together pretty easily. That was honestly the easiest one I've done so far. I have no idea why. Maybe just all these seams are just the best fit out of all of them so far. There were some where, you know, if I didn't line up the seams exactly right, then trying to get this lined up perfectly was just not going to happen. So I just had to make do. But this one went together really nicely. So yeah, all right. So now, like I said, I do start with these 2 edges first because those are the ones that have the glue flap on the large pentagon. I'll start with this one. So that gives me a little bit of flexibility to pull that edge back to get access to the glue flap, because now I've got to apply the UV resin to that flap. And this edge doesn't bend out as easily because it's got the glue flap here that's stiffening that edge. So, but I usually can, because I've cut that flap back so far that I can usually pull it out far enough to, I don't know if you can actually see that, but it's tricky when everything you're working with is transparent. But so that's the flap on the next part. But if you can see that edge right there, that's the glue flap. But I've kind of lifted it up, and now it's resting on top of the stiff edge of this internal wall here. So now I've got access to that full face of that flap to apply glue resin. So here we go. Now, another one of the challenges I've been dealing with that's led to some frustration is that I get, these are large sheets of flat plastic. They tend to build up static electricity, and the static electricity interacts with this resin it attracts it. And so as I just dip a little drip on there, but as I get close, you can see the drip tends to pull in towards this large flat sheet. And if the static charge is strong enough, it can actually pull the drip off. And then as it gets closer, it just like rips it apart and just splatters across the sheet in like spirals and blobs. And it just happens just like that. It's just instantaneous. I bring it over and then it just goes, and really frustrating. And then I've got to just clean everything off and redo it. Let me see if I can actually show you what I mean. So let me get a sacrificial sheet of, here we go. Here's a sheet, just some scraps from what I've cut out previously, and you can see it's got some static electricity. It's holding on to this scrap on its own. So let's just turn it up to 11 and rub this microfiber cloth over it like I do when I'm cleaning off fingerprints. That's, I think, is what's charging it up. So let me do that. Oh yeah, that's got a good charge. If I try to slide that on the cutting mat, it doesn't want to slide. It's just like stuck down to it. That is strong. I can feel it raising my arm hairs. It is some strong static. So, okay, now let's see if I can capture this on camera. The bigger the drip, the more it seems to do it. So here we go. Oh, I don't know if you saw that. Most of it missed. I didn't get close before the gravity just pulled it off, but let's try it again. You see that? I haven't even touched the sheet yet, and it's, whoo! There you go. Like, that's as close as I got. And you can see the stuff stretching out. I don't know if the camera's capturing that very well, but there you go. Anyway, it loves to do that. So that has been very frustrating to deal with. So I have noticed that, like, once I get some resin on, like, this is a giant sheet, so the effect is like extremely exaggerated here. Or what I'm dealing with over there is, I mean, the pentagon itself is pretty large, but the flap itself is not that big. So if I can manage to get the resin to the flap and start applying it, it seems to tamp down the charge a little bit once there's some already on there. So the further I go, the more I put on there, it tends to decrease that effect, and it gets easier to work with. Give me a second. I'm going to clean this up before I make even more of a mess. Okay, got that mess cleaned up. The worst part is, like, it doesn't just splatter onto the top of the sheet, right? It just goes to whatever it's closest to, and some of it gets underneath the sheet as well. And so that's, once I start gluing down all the edges, and maybe I'm working on the last two edges, if it gets underneath there, it's hard for me to reach up underneath there and clean it off. So yeah, it's a pain. So what I've found, the best thing to do is, I've tried, like, touching the sheet to metal objects to take the charge off of here, and I don't really have anything close to hand that seems grounded well enough that that's very effective. So what I do instead is I just make sure that my pick tool that I'm using to dip the resin out has the same charge as the sheet. So I'll just run the tool along the face of that sheet there, and that tends to just make these closer in charge level so that there's not a big difference between the two, and they're not quite as attracted as strongly. And that seems to work. I still have to be careful. I tend to work with smaller drips first, because those do get attracted, but they're less likely to get pulled all the way off. And so I'll work with small drops first. Like I said, once I start getting some of it on there, the more of it I get on there, the less that effect seems to happen. Then I can start working with bigger drips. But I always have to be careful, because, like, I mean, I have barely enough time to react. If I see it start to move, it's almost too late. It's just going to jump off there and splatter. So, all right, so let's get some of that on there. I'm going to try and do this in a way where you can see what I'm doing. So that's too big of a drip. I'll let some of that come off and then just do a little bit at first. Okay, it's seeming to behave well. So I try to run a bead about that size. Kind of see it there. Oh, that. There you go. That's a good view. About that size, more or less down the middle of that flap. It makes it less likely to squish out the one side or the other. But as you can see, I'm not being super precious about it. And then I just make sure I get some all the way out to the edge. Okay. Nice stuff. Thing about this, the nice thing about this stuff is that it doesn't really have like a working time that's anything to worry about. The only thing I really have to worry about is just the stuff dripping. And so now that I've got that on there, I just need to get that flap back in between the structural plastic and the cellophane. Here we go. Okay. And then I have to, the best way I found to apply even pressure all the way across is, just checking to make sure I don't have any on my fingers, is to actually take this face and put it against the table. And that gives me nice even pressure, and then I can apply some pressure from the inside by just essentially pushing up against the edge that I've just glued. And then I can see the glue edge down there. You probably can't see it from that angle, but if I just push in a little bit just to make sure that it's making good contact between those two. And the last step is to zap it with some UV. So I do like to try and make that as good of a bond as possible. So I try to put the pressure on the edge and turn on the little flashlight at the same time, which tends to be a little tricky because I've only got two hands and I'm using them both for other things. But there we go. The UV light is on. My finger's mostly in the way of it right now, but it's going to be start curing that right away. I'll slowly move this finger out of the way just so it gets more exposure. And I'll turn it to one side. Point the light more towards the right hand corner there. And that's good enough. I can let it go. And I'll turn it over to the left hand corner. And give it lots of light. Loves those photons. And then as a last step, I'll flip it up and shoot it from the other side. Okay, that's good enough for that one. So I got a little bit, I don't know if you noticed when I was picking that up, it kind of was stuck a little bit. So some of it can sometimes leak underneath and get on the tab. You can see a blob of it there where it's gotten onto the large pentagon. And other times it'll come out and just kind of just be a large blob that'll stick to the table. And that's okay. It's not that difficult to clean it up. I try not to put too much on so I don't have to clean it up, but it's inevitable. It happens. I just use tweezers to kind of carefully pick that off. I don't want to apply too much pressure because the tips of these tweezers are sharp and they will scratch the plastic if I push too hard. Sometimes if that doesn't work, I'll just go to town with the paper towel to get most of it off. Almost like gently sands it off. But I'm going to leave that. That's fine for now. I don't want to, I've only got one edge down here and I don't want to shift too much stuff around. So I'm going to go ahead and work on these other edges. I can come back and clean that up later. That hasn't seemed to be an issue. But the other thing I do want to make sure is I get it left some on my cutting mat here. So make sure I clean that up so I don't transfer that inadvertently to other pieces, other parts of the piece. Okay, so then that's that edge. This is the other edge that has a glue flap, so that'll be next. Okay, that's looking good. So then usually I'll save these two for last, just because I can get, I don't know, I just do. So I'll do this one next. I always put the lid back on this because I'm paranoid about stray UV from that getting down into there and curing it, because it doesn't take much, honestly, to have a reaction, so I don't want to ruin my bottle. And I'm also paranoid about just knocking it over and spilling it everywhere, so looks pretty good. And this stuff actually, I'm pleased. I mean, it's a little messy to work with sometimes, but honestly, it bonds so quickly, and if I'm careful about it, I get a nice clean look. So yeah, I'm pleased with that. Looks great. All right, these last two, I basically have to do them both at once, because if I just have 4 edges bonded down, then, you know, if this edge is bonded, then it's really hard to get underneath there to that last edge. So got to do them both at the same time. But that hasn't been a problem so far. Okay, still pretty good alignment. This corner here is a little loose from that previous bond there. That's the double-sided tape. It started to come off there. I had that happen on one of the other ones, and I just put a little drop of the UV resin up under there and zapped that really quick. So I think I'll do the same thing here. The trick is just being able to get up underneath there. There's a tiny little spot where I can fit the tool through. And if hopefully it won't do the static thing. Okay. If I do a small enough drop, that doesn't seem to be as oh, it just did it there. But it just kind of pulled it to the side and got stuck to that wall instead of to the glue flap. There we go. That's probably good enough. I can't really get under there and put pressure on that joint to reseal with the double-sided tape, so this is kind of my only option. So I'll just push that until it's, I can see that the two surfaces are coming together and squishing out the UV resin, so just takes a second. So this process is exothermic, and when you're holding it with your finger like this, I could feel this especially when I was going around on all these little spots. I was just holding it with my finger and zapping it, and you can feel the heat come off of it as that resin solidifies. It's interesting. Okay. All right, so last edge. Let's do our little static equalization. Okay, so there it is. That's the complete process of installing one of those outer pentagons. There's some fluff on there, but that's just on the outside. I'll go back through and clean up some of those spots where it oozed out from the seams. There's a few little smudges on the outside. I can clean those up as well. But yeah, that's basically it. Just do the same thing for the last one here. And yeah, wow, this thing will be basically done. So I'll come back for that. Okay, here it is. It is finished. I've got all the outer panels attached, and I've even got the ghost inside. So there's my two halves. And then I've just got some tissue paper to wrap up my little ghost friend. And the stand fits in there nicely. So here it is. So yeah, I mean, I'm really pleased with how this turned out. I had no idea going into this if this was going to work at all. It was just a crazy idea I had when I was thinking about wrapping up this ghost to give to a friend, and yeah, I had no idea how I was going to do it until I just said, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. So I had to experiment with the materials a little bit to find something that would actually work. Experiment with the techniques to figure out how to get the right effects. So these lines that radiate outward from the center, all that, I like the way that looks. I mean, it doesn't look exactly like a bright engram. It's a little more, I don't know, a little more flashy. The bright engrams are a little more, what's the word? Simple or reserved, I guess. There's a lot more flashy colors going on here than what you see in the game, but I like it. Still turned out great. And so yeah, let me know in the comments what you think, and if it's inspired you to experiment with some things of your own. That's, I guess, one of the main reasons why I like to share what I'm doing, share my projects, is just to maybe spark some creativity in others, and I don't know, share the joy in building things. So yeah, that's my Destiny Engram gift box complete. Thanks for watching.